Father, in simplicity but sincerity, we come today asking that you would send your Holy Spirit to speak to each of us in just the way that we need as we engage with the story of Scripture today, and that each of us would be able to take something from here that you have for us that helps connect us more fully to you and to live in ways that are freeing and honoring to you. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. We are in part 6 of this series, Study in Contrast, and we have been looking at the stories of King Saul, and we just began looking at King David. And there is a specific phrase that I have put up on the screen today that I think helps us begin to connect with the idea that will come through this story. And I'll share that story with you in just a moment, but it is the idea of the divine element. Too often we calculate without the divine element. And today in our story, we're going to see a group of people who did exactly that, which most all of us can identify with. But then we're going to see an individual who calculated with the divine element. And we'll be able to see how much of a difference that made in not only their actions, but the freedom internally to engage in what God had called them to do. So again, we are contrasting two characters, the first two kings of the nation of Israel, King Saul and his successor, King David. We have gotten to the place where we are starting to see an increase in David within the nation. And this story today is one that cements him within the consciousness of the army and all nation as a whole. So take a look today as we go through this story, and you will see this. The context, I think, is extremely important as we look into this story to kind of situate it within a context of what we've seen so far. So the Philistines and the Israelites, these are two opposing groups of people. Philistines live to the west of the nation of Israel, kind of 15 or so miles west of Bethlehem, which we'll get to in just a moment, and then all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea. And they are enemies of Israel. There have been wars and skirmishes going back and forth between the two. If you have read the early parts of 1 Samuel, you'll find that some of those the Israelites lost. And one of them, they lost so badly that the Philistines actually captured the ark, which was the symbol of the presence of God within the nation. They captured it. Things didn't go so well for them. It went actually so terribly when they had the ark in their possession that they got to thinking, we need to send this thing back because this is not good. The God is unhappy with us. We need to send this thing that symbolizes him and his presence, we need to send it back to the nation of Israel. Some of you are smiling because you remember that story. Jonathan, Saul's son, has had a recent military victory over the Philistines, which you can read about in chapter 14. Kind of a miraculous one. And now we find that they are kind of drawn up in battle in a specific place. 1 Samuel 14:52, right at the end of that chapter, tells us that there was fierce war between the Philistines and the Israelites all the days of Saul. That's a long time to be engaged in battle. These skirmishes back and forth, that's a long time. That's what the text tells us. We also found that the Spirit of God left Saul just recently in a previous chapter based on the choices that he had made to reject God and his way of living life. David has been secretly anointed as Saul's successor. David knows this. David's a teenager, has been anointed as the next king of Israel, but nothing has happened yet, except for the fact that the text tells us that the Spirit of God comes upon David in a powerful way from that day forward. So we have this point in time, and God chooses him and then imbues him, if you will, pours into him his Spirit. That's kind of the context that we're in today. David is also beginning his transition as the faithful shepherd of his father's sheep, father meaning Jesse, his biological father, to the faithful shepherd of his heavenly father's sheep, the nation of Israel. And all of those things that David learned, the character lessons, the bravery that he has shown, his vision of God and his understanding of himself in relation to God and who God is, all of that begins to come through in this story today. So that's kind of the idea. And the thing I want you to pay special attention to, do you remember doing this as kids? Some of you are like, what? You don't remember? Like, I want to see, right? I gotta see. So most of us can't even we can't even get our hands up that way. They don't flex that much anymore. But it was so that we could see better. That was the idea, right? We want to see. Today, I want you to focus on something. I want you to focus on what does everyone else see and hear, and what does David see and hear? Keep that in mind as we go along. All right, location. As was mentioned earlier, the location is about 15 miles west of Bethlehem. So we've kind of gone a little bit downhill. You can see the color differentiation. It's a little bit more elevated up around Bethlehem, and then we kind of slowly go down as we go west. And at the bottom of your screen, there's a little dot with a name called Soko, and then another one, Azekah. So the Philistine army is camped in between those two little areas. And where the red dot is kind of the general idea of a location where the valley of Elah is, and the Israelites are camped on the north side of that little valley. Not these big valleys, if you've ever been to Switzerland and you can't see the top of them, not quite like that. Or even Yosemite, not like that. Much smaller, but the idea of a little valley, and you've got the armies encamped on either side. Now David lives in Bethlehem, and as we're going to see in a little bit, he's going to head over to this general area, which is about 15 miles. How would you like to have a war happening 15 miles from your house? This was not uncommon in their day. And sadly, for many people in our world, it's not uncommon for them either. All right, the setting. There is a waiting game going on. Both sides have drawn up on either side of this valley, and they really don't want to engage in battle, because when you engage in battle, you incur losses, right? Most battles don't go without loss. And so both sides have drawn up, but they are just kind of in this holding pattern. And the idea comes from the Philistine army. Hey, let's send a champion. Let's send a representative of our army down into the valley, and then call for the other side to send their representative down, and let's settle this battle just between those two people. Now, this is something that actually within the culture around them was not uncommon. We find evidence of this in Babylonian culture and Assyrian culture and some of the different cultures that are around where people actually engaged in this sort of thing. So this is not unheard of for them to advance this kind of an idea. What we also discover is that the outcome of those was not something that both sides of either army always accepted. So if your army lost, it didn't mean that you actually lost the battle. You might go into it saying, all right, if we lose, well, then you win. But most of the time, if you lose, you just keep fighting because you're not about to give in. So this was more of it was a strange kind of a thing. You just never knew if the other side was actually going to go for it or not. So again, we've got this valley, we've got armies on either side, and they're just in this holding pattern. And then we come to the part of the text. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you would like to follow along and read a little bit more than we're going to have time to do, it's in 1 Samuel 17. I'll put the scriptures up on the screen that we're going to look at today. But we come into the point of the story in which Goliath shows up. And Goliath is big. He's really big. The text tells us that he is about 9.5 feet tall. Now, I don't know anybody that's 9.5 feet tall, but I've seen some people that are about 7 feet tall, and I even feel short. I can't imagine, that's about 3 meters for those of you that maybe grew up with a different system of measurement. I can't imagine seeing someone that tall and that is proportioned. His coat of armor was 125 pounds. Can you imagine wearing something that was 125 pounds? And just the tip of his spear was about 15 pounds. Just the iron tip itself was about 15 pounds. Now, we have some weights at home. Any of you have little, hand weights at home? About 10 of us, all right. How many used them? Don't raise your hands. Dust those things off there. So we have one at home, and I picked it up, and it was about 8 pounds. And I said to myself, I can't imagine something weighing about twice this much coming in contact with my body. Go right through you. So he's big enough that this is the kind of thing, for most of us, we'd just be walking around like, I don't want to hold this anymore. Goliath is big enough, proportionate enough, that when he picks up the spear, it's balanced, it's normal for him. About 15 pounds, just the head of his spear. It's interesting how the text really slows down when it gets to Goliath. And it enumerates his armor and his size and kind of his demeanor and bravado to build the intensity of this story. Because we're not just dealing with any warrior, we're dealing with one of the biggest ones that exists. And so he comes out down into the valley as the champion, and this is what he says. This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. Now imagine if you're on the side of the Israelites and you see this guy that big and well proportioned, and he comes down and he says, hey, send me somebody. Come on, let's do this. What would you be feeling? Yeah, I don't think so. Anybody else? Right? So this is the kind of thing that is happening where this mighty champion comes down and he shouts these types of things to the army. There's a word that's highlighted here, and it's the word defy. It's the idea of a challenge, but also a belittling kind of a statement. Who are you? Who do you think you are? I defy you to find somebody that can give me any kind of combat. Who do you think you are? The text also tells us in verse 16 that this happened for 40 days, morning and evening. Goliath came down into the valley with all of his stuff in his size, and he shouted at the army for 40 days, every morning and every night, taunting them. Who do you think you are? Send me somebody, and let's see how this goes. Text tells us in verse 24, whenever the Israelites saw the man, what did they do? They all banded together and said, let's do this, right? Text says they all fled from him, not in a little bit of fear, but in great fear. So they're all lined up, and Goliath comes out, and they all turn around and let's just get out of here. He's that imposing of a figure. This is extreme fear. And it's interesting how the text uses the word saw. They're seeing with their eyes an impossible situation, a formidable foe that they see no way to win. So let's see a little bit of what they're seeing. They're in a desperate situation. He's a giant man intimidating his foes. We see an army that is gripped with fear. We see insurmountable problems, odds that are too great to win, a king and an army who sees only the odds that their eyes can see, only the problems, only the reasons why success is unlikely. That's all they see, because they're only looking with their eyes. They forgot the divine element. Have you been there? Have you been in that situation? It seems hopeless, it seems impossible, it seems too big. Maybe you're there right now. I want to share something with you that the army, the king, and the religious leaders of the day forgot. This is taken from Deuteronomy chapter 20, and when I read this, it was just a huge shock. I read it this week, and I know I have read this several times in the Bible, but for some reason, I did not connect with it until today. Listen to what they had forgotten that God had promised them as a part of the covenant that He had made with them. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, what does He say? Do not be afraid of them. Have you ever heard the phrase, some things are easier said than done? We would probably say this is one of those things. This is easier said than done. He says, when you see an army that is far greater than yours, you're outnumbered and the odds seem hopeless, don't be afraid of them. But He doesn't stop there, thankfully. Why? Because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. So He identifies Himself as their God, which means that He is identifying with them as His people. And then He says, the God who brought you up out of Egypt. Do you remember all those miracles that I did to get you into this land, to deliver you? Don't forget what I've already done. That was impossible. And I'll be with you in this moment. But He doesn't stop there. Verse 2, when you are about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army. It's an amazing thing. So the priest comes forward, and he's got the whole army lined up there, and he's going to give them a speech of encouragement. And this is what he's supposed to say. He shall say, verse 3, "Hear, Israel." Like, listen, pay attention to this. "Today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them." Which is to say that most of them would have had this tendency because they would have been outnumbered a lot of the time. God speaks to what we actually deal with. And these kinds of things let us know that. He goes on, "For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to" what? To fight for you. It's not like God says, "Oh, by the way, I'll just be back there cheering you on. I'll be way back there." Well, thanks, right? Like, I think that's helpful. No. He says, "I'll be the one that is fighting for you against your enemies." To do what? To give you the victory. So if you think about it in that kind of a term, in that kind of a situation, instead of "how can we win," the phrase would be, "how could we lose?" Right? Why? Because we're strong and we have lots of people? No. We're outnumbered. But we have the divine element on our side. God fights for us. But we forget. We forget the promises that God has made. We forget all of the things that He has done, not just in Scripture, but in our past history. I mean, if we stopped here today to listen to stories from people within this very room of the kinds of miracles that you've experienced in your life that God has done, we'd be pretty inspired. But as human beings, we have the tendency to forget what God has actually done. And when we forget, we cave into fear too often. And I'm one of those people too. Back to the story. Jesse, David's father, has 3 of his sons who were at the battle. And so he says to David, "Hey, David, I want you to take some supplies to your brothers and to the captain of the group that they're in. So head off early in the morning, run over there, give them the stuff, and check in and see how they're doing, if they're still okay, and then bring a report back to me." And David, as a teenager, says, "Oh, yeah, sure, no problem, I'll go." So he gets up early in the morning. It's not always something I like to do. Gets up early in the morning, and he grabs all the stuff, and he runs off about 15 miles to the battle. He knew exactly where he was going, and he shows up there, and he finds his brothers, checks in with them. And as he was talking, verse 23 tells us, with them, with his brothers, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Now, everybody's been hearing this for roughly 40 days, morning and evening, and they just feel hopeless. They just see a problem that's insurmountable. But when David hears his defiance, he hears something that it seems no one else hears. So for just a moment, let's look at what David sees and what David hears versus what everyone else seems to see and hear. This is taken from the Expositor's Bible Commentary, which I found extremely helpful in this little tidbit right here. The men of Israel call Goliath this man. David calls him this uncircumcised Philistine. Like, who does he think he is? Right? Do you see the difference in perception? Oh, this man versus who is this guy? David hears and sees differently than the rest of the people do. Next thing. They say that Goliath has come out to defy Israel. David says that he has come out to defy the armies of who? The living God. Now, by extension, when you belittle something that is connected to God, who are you actually belittling? God himself. This is God's army. They just say, oh, he's come out to defy Israel. David says, no, he's come out to defy God's army. By implication, God himself. Who does he think he is? Let's go to the next one. They refer to Goliath's potential victor as the man who kills him, as if there's going to be anybody. David refers to him as the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel. Because David realizes that the whole nation has been disgraced. More importantly, the name of God has been disgraced. And that's a step too far for David. If you want to talk about me, no problem. But when you start implicating my God, step too far, David says. David sees and hears differently. So the army sees a foe who is too powerful for them. David sees someone who is arrogant enough to insult the God of Israel and his army, to insult the living God of the universe. I used a different word than arrogant originally, but I thought for the context of church I should change it. Dagon, the god of the Philistines, was nothing more than a carved or cast image. One of their own people had to make him. And if you've read 1 Samuel chapter 5, when the ark of God shows up in the Philistine camp and they bring that into their temple of Dagon, you remember what happens to Dagon when they find him in the morning? He's fallen face down. Oh, whoops. So we prop him back up. Next morning they come into the temple, Dagon's down on his face again, except this time he broke off his head and his hands. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd start to beginning to think like, maybe we need to consider changing sides, right? Life's thing versus the living God. David knew this. All right, so Saul, he is offering presents, he's offering incentives, he's offering gifts to anyone who's willing to go out and be their champion. Have you ever tried to get somebody to do something and you've offered them all kinds of incentives and no takers? So Saul is offering wealth, he's offering his daughter in marriage, which means you get married in to the royal line. Wonder how his daughter felt about that. And the last thing he's offering is exemption from taxes for the entire family of this individual. Now, the older we get in life, it's that last thing that really starts to make a difference, isn't it? You know, when we're young and we're teenagers, it's like, taxes, what are you talking about? I don't care about that stuff. And then we get a little older and we're like, ooh, that's really important. It's a big deal. David's a teenager. So Saul's offering all these kinds of incentives to try to get somebody to go down, because Saul is unwilling to go. And nobody else in the army is willing to go. because they're all afraid. Verse 26, David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So what's the king going to do? Tell me. And so they tell him. Patriarchs and Prophets, this is a little quote that I pulled out of this chapter. Read it again last night to my wife, but read this week, and this is the quote that I just love in this chapter. David was fired with zeal to preserve the honor of the living God and the credit of his people. And this really starts to get at one of the key things about David is that he's not in it for himself. David is not like, ooh, this is an amazing opportunity for me to show my stuff. David's not proud. He has zeal for God's name. And God's name is being dragged in the mud, and David can't stand it. So David talks to his brothers. There is this exchange where his oldest brother accuses David of things when the bottom line is he's just jealous. Jealous that David actually is willing to do something that he, as the oldest brother, is unwilling to do. But he's not going to tell David that. Instead, he condemns him. It's just jealousy. And then he's brought to Saul because this is overheard. Hey, there's some guy over here, this young kid, who is saying some really strange things. I think you should hear him. And so he shows up to Saul, and this is what he says. Imagine the king listening to a teenager tell you this. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Okay. Wow. David's just straightforward. David sees something that nobody else sees. Saul replied, verse 33, "You are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him." You ever had somebody like, try to put you in your place and just put you down? David's there. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. The odds are stacked against you. This is not a good scenario. You can't go. It's not going to go well for you." Saul only sees with his eyes. And we would say in some respects, Saul's just kind of going with what most of us would have seen and gone with. But David sees differently. So he says to Saul, "All right, you've got a bit of a challenge with me and my size, maybe my age. Let me tell you a few things." David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and bear, this uncircumcised Philistine." It's interesting how he tries to put him in perspective. It's not this big giant of a man, it's this guy. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. And then he says this in closing. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Who's David getting credit to? God. He recognizes that as a shepherd, the reason that he was victorious was not just his bravery, it's because God delivered him. And God's going to deliver him from this guy too. Because David sees differently. And that's faith. David sees with the eyes of faith. Something that it seems nobody else was able to do. David sees differently. and he trusts God. So Saul finally concedes, gives him his armor. David starts to walk around and says, this is not going to work. I've never used this stuff before. I don't know how this stuff works. This doesn't fit me. There's a life lesson right there. We don't have time to go into it. Instead, David takes his shepherd's staff, his little satchel, and he stops along the stream bed down in that valley, and he picks up 5 smooth stones and he puts them in his little pouch. And David starts walking down and walking forward. Now, if you're one of the people standing there from the Israelite army, imagine what's going through your head right now. Oh, this is going to be bad. What are they doing sending this kid down there? He's going to lose. And we're all going to feel so terrible to have to watch this. Because all they can see is this teenager and the giant. So David just keeps right on walking. Because there's something that David knows. He's small, and Goliath is really big. Goliath has a shield bearer going in front of him. That's 2 against 1. With Goliath, it's kind of like 10 against 1. But you get the idea, 2 against 1. But David realizes something that nobody in the army realizes. And he realizes something that Goliath doesn't realize. David's not alone. As David walks down into that valley, he knows who's with him. And the God who is with him is way bigger and stronger and more powerful than the guy down at the other end of the valley. No matter how big he may look, David knows that his God is far bigger. Don't forget that in life. Goliath says a bunch of things to David when he finally discovers that it is a teenager they have sent out to him. He is incensed. His pride is wounded. And so he uses every curse in the book to hurl at David of all the things he's going to do to him. And David throws it right back at him because he's unafraid. He walks up, and this is what he says. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defied. In your arrogance, Goliath, you have overstepped your bounds. You don't know the God that I serve, but I do. And he's with me. I'm his representative today. And if you knew him, you would have never walked down into this valley today. He goes on, verse 46. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down. David says a few more things. We'll go on. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. David's chief concern is that people would know that God is alive and well. He is concerned for God's honor, and that everybody would know what God can do. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. Not just the one guy down here in the valley, or the 2 guys down here in the valley, but all of you listening. This is how it's going to go today. Because I see something that none of you see. Even the people on my side don't see it, but I do. I see the God who stands with me. Size, numbers, weapons, none of that matters to my God. He doesn't need any of that. This was too much for Goliath. And so he pushes his helmet up and he runs towards David. Probably more angry than he's ever been in his life to be talked to like that by a teenager. And David does something that nobody expects. He runs towards him. Why? Because he knows who's on his side. He knows he's not alone. He reaches his hand into his little bag and he pulls out that stone and he drops it in his sling and he starts to wind up. And here comes Goliath with all of his might and all of his mass. David spins. And then he lets go. And that little rock flies straight as an arrow to the one place that Goliath was not prepared for, right into his forehead. Text says that it sunk into his forehead. Now, David might be strong, but I would like to think that there was a little extra propulsion that day in his sling. Because David wasn't alone. Now, you can read the rest of the story to see what happens. It's a little gruesome in our modern world. But let's just say God wins. And all he was waiting for was someone who would trust him. And David was that man. Because David saw what no one else did. Some of us right now are dealing with our own Goliath. There's a situation that we are facing and it seems impossible. It seems too big. It seems hopeless. And we're starting to feel as if this is never, ever going to change. And we're not talking about this thing that is all about us and our pride. We're talking about that thing that really impacts our faith and our relationship with God. Because it's eclipsing Him in our vision. Some of us are in that moment right now, and some of us have been there. So in these moments, what do we see? We just see the problem. We see the odds. We see the insurmountable, impossible obstacle. It's too big. It's too much. And the thing that we forget about is the God who is bigger than our problems. The God who, when He looks at this impossible situation to us, says, I can't tell you how many ways I can get you around this, but I've got more than one. I'm bigger than your problems. I'm bigger than the impossibility that you see. I'm the God of impossibilities. And I want to be really honest with you today that if you're the kind of person that's feeling in these moments, God, I have missed seeing you. I've given into fear and hopelessness, and I don't know how this is supposed to work. If you're that kind of person, I want you to know that there are times I identify with that. I've been there. I felt that way. But here's what I know. That God is not pointing His finger at all of us and telling us just to shape up and hurry up and get with the program. What He's trying to do is turn our attention from the problem to Him. Because as we begin to see Him like David did, He begins to help us put things in perspective with Him in the calculation. And so I believe what God is trying to do today for all of us is to shift our focus and what we see, to be able to see more than what meets the eye. There's a story in 2 Kings, and I'm just going to read one text for you because I believe that this sums things up so well. Elisha has gone down to a certain city, and the king of the opposing army is upset because it seems like no matter what he says, the army of Israel already knows about it, and they are prepared for it. And finally, he figures out that Elisha has got to be part of the problem. They figure out where he is, and they send their army down there, and they encircle this town. And Elisha's servant gets up in the morning and he walks out onto the rooftop because they have flat roofs in that part of the world at that time. And he walks out and he can see across the city beyond the walls, and all he sees, everywhere he looks, is the opposing army. And he's freaking out. And he goes back in and he tells Elisha, "This is bad. They're all showing up. We are surrounded." And this is what Elisha says. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 17. Elisha prays, speaking to God, and he says, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." So that he can see differently. He can see what he's missing. Because all he can see right now are the problems, the impossibilities, the obstacles, the hopeless situation. And Elisha prays, "God, open the eyes, if you will, of his soul so that he can see you." To see what's actually here, not just what only his eyes can see. Then the Lord, the text says, opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw in a way he had never seen before. The hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. He saw differently, and it changed everything about how he felt. So here's the equation. By myself, yeah, it's impossible. But with little me and big God, oh, it's very possible. I hope you can take that with you today. In whatever you're dealing with or whatever you're going to deal with, remember the divine element. And as that song says, turn your eyes upon Jesus and look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace.